She spent her last coins on broken chickens nobody wanted, and the whole town laughed in her face. But one silent rancher saw what no one else could. 3 years later, that same town would beg her for a seat at her table. This is the story of Delaney Cross, the woman everyone mocked for choosing the broken ones, and how a crate of crippled hens became the spark that brought down an empire of lies. Stay with me to the end of this story, and drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The auction yard smelled like manure and sweat and something burning 2 farms over, and Delaney Cross stood at the back of the crowd where she always stood, where nobody had to look at her twice. Red Hollow didn't have much in the way of entertainment, so auction day did double duty. Half the town came for stock. The other half came to watch. "There she is," somebody muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Wonder what she's going to embarrass herself buying this time." Delaney didn't turn around. She'd learned a long time ago that turning around only gave them more to laugh at. She was 24 years old, built heavy through the shoulders and hips in a way that made the town's women whisper behind gloved hands, and she'd been the subject of Red Hollow's jokes since she was 11 years old, and her mother had died, leaving her alone with a father who drank himself into the ground within 2 winters. She'd buried him too, eventually. Nobody had come to that funeral either. Lot 42, the auctioneer called, a wiry man named Eustace Pratt, who ran these auctions with the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Crate of layers, mixed condition. Mixed condition. That was a polite way of saying what everybody in the yard already knew just by looking at the crate sitting in the dirt near the fence. 11 chickens, every one of them wrong somehow. A hen with a foot curled up and useless. Another blind in one eye, white film over it like spoiled milk. Feathers missing in ugly patches. One of them couldn't even stand right, just listed sideways like a boat taking water. "Who's going to want that?" a woman near Delaney said to her friend, not quietly. "Pratt ought to just put 'em down and save everybody the trouble of looking at 'em." Delaney looked anyway. She'd been looking at that crate since they unloaded it an hour ago, and something in her chest had gone tight and aching in a way she didn't have words for yet. "Do I have an opener?" Pratt called out. "Come on, somebody bid something. I got 6 more lots after this and the light's going." Nobody raised a hand. A man near the front laughed and said something about chicken stew being the only fate for that lot, and a ripple of laughter went through the crowd, easy and careless, the kind of laughter that didn't even require a victim to land. Except today it did. Today the victim was standing 11 feet from the crate, working up the nerve to do something she knew would make her the joke of Red Hollow for another year, at least. She had $4.60 to her name. She'd counted it 3 times that morning, sitting at her kitchen table in the gray dark before sunup, in the house that had been her father's and was falling down slow around her ears. She'd come to the auction to buy hens, healthy ones, layers that would actually lay, that she could build a flock from, sell eggs in town, maybe scratch together enough to fix the roof before the next hard rain came through and rotted what was left of it. That was the plan. "Going once," Pratt said, already looking past the crate to the next lot. Delaney raised her hand. The yard went quiet in that particular way a crowd goes quiet when it smells something good coming. Not good for her, good for them, good for the story they'd tell at supper that night. "Miss Cross?" Pratt's eyebrows went up. He knew her well enough, knew she didn't have money to throw at foolishness. "I'll take the lot," Delaney said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. $2. $2 for that? That was Hollis Webb, a rancher with land to the north and an opinion about everything. He laughed outright, slapping his knee like she'd told the funniest joke he'd heard all season. "Hell, Pratt, I'll give you $2 to just shoot 'em and put 'em out of their misery." More laughter. Somebody near the fence made a sound like a hen dying, exaggerated and cruel, and that got the biggest laugh of all. Delaney felt her face go hot, felt the old familiar urge to shrink down into herself and disappear, the urge that had been her only defense since she was a girl, getting her hair pulled in the schoolyard for being too big and too poor and too motherless. But she didn't shrink. She looked at that crate, at the hen with the curled foot trying so hard to balance on the floor of it, fighting for purchase with the leg that still worked, and something in her just set. $2, she said again, louder this time. "I've got $2 and I'm asking for the lot." Pratt looked around the yard like he was waiting for somebody, anybody, to put up real money and end this farce. Nobody did. Why would they spend a dime on birds they'd already decided were worthless? Sold, Pratt said, sounding almost embarrassed about it, to Miss Cross for $2. The laughter followed her all the way to the crate, and it followed her while she counted coins into Pratt's palm, and it followed her while she knelt down in the dirt in her one good dress and looked through the slats at 11 broken birds who'd stopped fighting each other for space because there wasn't any fight left in most of them. "Hey now," a voice called out, young and mean. "You gonna name 'em? Maybe call that blind one Hollis, on account of he don't see good either." That one got a real laugh, the kind that rolled. Delaney didn't answer. She got her arms under the crate, felt the weight of it settle into her back and shoulders, and she carried it through the parting crowd with her chin level and her eyes fixed straight ahead, the way she'd taught herself to walk through Red Hollow, since she was old enough to understand that the staring wasn't going to stop. Not ever. Not for her. She didn't see the man standing near the fence at the far end of the yard, half in the shadow of the loading chute, who hadn't laughed once. Rowan Ashcroft hadn't meant to come to the auction at all. He'd ridden down from his place up in the high country with the intention of buying feed and getting back before dark, because dark was when the ranch felt the emptiest, and he'd arranged his whole life since Esther died around avoiding that particular hour as much as he could. He was 38 years old, broad through the chest in the way men get from years of physical work rather than years at a gym, with a beard he kept short because Esther used to trim it for him, and he hadn't figured out yet whether he wanted to let it grow wild as some kind of grief or keep it neat as some kind of denial that anything had changed at all. He hadn't decided. 3 years on, and he still hadn't decided about most things. He'd noticed the crate of broken hens the same as everyone else had. You couldn't not notice the way they huddled together at one end like they were trying to make themselves smaller, trying to take up less room in a world that had already decided they took up too much. And he'd noticed the heavy young woman standing apart from the crowd, the one everyone seemed to know and nobody seemed to like, the one the jokes kept circling back toward like she was the only entertainment Red Hollow had on offer that week. He hadn't expected her to bid. When she did, when she stood there and took the mockery without folding under it, something in Rowan's chest did a slow turn he didn't have a name for either. He watched her count coins she clearly couldn't spare. He watched her kneel in the dirt without flinching from it, like dirt had never been beneath her, like nothing about that crate disgusted her even a little. He watched the boy yell his cruel joke about naming the blind hen after Hollis Webb, and he watched her face not move at all, not one muscle, like she'd built a wall a long time ago and reinforced it every single day since. Rowan had buried a wife. He knew something about walls. He found himself walking toward her before he'd consciously decided to. "That's a heavy load for one person," he said, when he was close enough that she could hear him without him raising his voice and giving the yard something else to laugh at. Delaney's eyes came up to his, wary, already braced for whatever was coming next. She didn't know him, knew the name Ashcroft, the way everybody in the valley knew it, but she'd never had reason to speak 2 words to the man. "I've managed worse," she said. "I expect you have." He looked down at the crate, at the hen with the bad foot trying to wedge itself against its neighbor for balance. "Where are you taking them?" "Home." She said it like a challenge, like she was waiting for him to laugh too, to ask her why she'd wasted $2 on birds that wouldn't lay, wouldn't fatten, wouldn't do anything but die slow on whatever scrap of land she had left. He didn't laugh. "My wagon's right there," he said, nodding toward it. "I can carry that crate further than you can on foot, and it looks like you've got a piece to walk yet. I know you don't need it," he said, even and quiet. "I'm offering anyway." Something about the way he said it, not pity, not the careful kindness people sometimes performed when they wanted credit for being decent to the town joke, made Delaney go still. She looked at him properly for the first time. Tired eyes. A grief sitting behind them that hadn't worn off yet, even 3 years gone. If the talk was right about when his wife had passed. Hands that had done real work, the kind that left calluses in honest places. "Why?" she said. It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation dressed up as one. Rowan considered the crate of broken hens for a long moment before he answered. "Because anybody willing to spend her last coin on creatures everybody else gave up on," he said, "is somebody I'd like to know better." The yard had mostly moved on by then, Pratt calling out the next lot, the crowd's attention drifting away from Delaney now that she wasn't actively providing a show. But Hollis Webb was still close enough to overhear, and he snorted. "Careful there, Ashcroft," Hollis called out, grinning. Folks will start saying you're as touched as she is. Rowan didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Delaney. Folks say a lot of things, he said. Most of it's wrong. He bent down and got his hands under the crate before she could argue further, and the hens shifted and clucked their thin, worn-out sounds, and he carried them to his wagon like they weighed nothing at all, like there was no indignity in it whatsoever. Delaney followed because she didn't know what else to do. Her whole body was still humming from the auction yard, from the laughter, from the strange, unfamiliar fact of a man treating her like she'd done something worth respecting instead of something worth mocking. "I can take them from here," she said when they reached the wagon. "I don't want you going out of your way. It's no trouble." He settled the crate carefully, like the birds inside it might actually matter, might actually feel the difference between being set down hard and being set down gentle. "Where's home?" "Cross Place. Edge of town, past the old mill road." Rowan knew it. Everybody in the valley knew it, the same way everybody knew the Cross name. Old Silas Cross, dead 3 years now from drink. And before that, his wife Adeline, who died younger, died sudden, died with a reputation Rowan had only ever heard secondhand and never put much stock in. People liked stories more than they liked the truth, especially when the truth was inconvenient. "That's a fair walk," he said. "I'll drive you." "You don't need to do that either." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He didn't move to help her up into the wagon, didn't crowd her, just stood there with the patient stillness of a man who'd learned how to wait for things. For crops, for healing, for grief to loosen its grip even a little. Delaney looked at him, looked at the crate of hens that had already started settling now that the jostling had stopped, and made a decision she'd spend the rest of her life being grateful for. She climbed up. They didn't talk much on the ride out. Rowan wasn't a man who filled silence just to fill it, and Delaney had spent so many years guarding her words around people that opening her mouth without a fight attached to it felt almost foreign. But somewhere past the mill turnoff, with the wagon wheels grinding slow over rutted dirt and the hens murmuring soft complaints behind them, Rowan spoke again. "You ever kept chickens before?" "My mother did, before she passed." Delaney kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I remember some of it, not all. Those birds back there." He nodded behind them without taking his eyes off the road. "Most folks would have put them down rather than feed them through winter. No profit in it." "I know." Delaney's jaw tightened. "You don't have to tell me what everybody thinks. I heard it plenty back at the yard. I wasn't telling you what everybody thinks." His voice stayed even, no heat in it. "I was telling you what's true. There's no profit in it. Doesn't mean there's no reason." Delaney glanced at him sideways. "And what reason is that in your accounting?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, like he was turning the question over carefully before he handed back an answer. "My wife used to say something," he said, finally. "Said the measure of a person wasn't how they treated what was useful to them. It was how they treated what wasn't." Something in Delaney's chest pulled tight at that, sharp enough that she had to look away from him, out at the dry fields running past. "That's a fine thing to say," she said, quieter than before. "She was a fine woman. I'm sorry for your loss." She didn't know if it was the right thing to say, but it was the true thing, and lately she'd been trying to stick to true things even when they were clumsy. Rowan nodded once, didn't say anything else about it, and Delaney respected that more than she could have explained. Grief wasn't something you poked at in a man you'd known for 20 minutes. She knew that from the inside. When they reached the Cross Place, a sagging farmhouse with a porch that leaned a few degrees off true, a barn missing half its roof shingles, a garden gone to weed because Delaney hadn't had the seed money to plant it proper this spring, Rowan didn't say anything about the state of it. Didn't let his face do anything Delaney could read as pity or judgment either. He just helped her carry the crate to the old coop out back, a structure that had seen better decades, and set it down gentle in the dirt. "They'll need warmth tonight," he said, looking at the gaps in the coop walls where the wood had rotted through. "And something for that foot." He nodded at the hen still listing sideways. "Looks like it healed wrong a while back. Might be able to splint it better, give it a chance to set right this time." "You know about that kind of thing?" "I know about most kinds of broken things." He said it simply, without weight, but Delaney heard the second meaning sitting underneath it anyway. Ranch life teaches you one way or another. He helped her stuff what rags and old burlap she had into the gaps in the coop, working alongside her without being asked, without making a show of how generous he was being. By the time the sun dropped low and orange over the western ridge, the coop was as snug as either of them could make it with what was on hand, and the 11 broken hens had settled into the straw like they understood, on some animal level, that something had shifted for them today. "I should get back," Rowan said, straightening up, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Ranch doesn't run itself." "Thank you," Delaney said. "For the wagon, for this." She gestured at the coop. "You didn't have to do any of it." "I know." He looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding something. "I've got a proposition for you, if you're willing to hear it." Delaney's guard went back up, fast and automatic. "What kind of proposition?" "My ranch is up in this high country, past Brennan's Pass. I run cattle, some crop, but it's a big operation for one man and a handful of hands who'd rather be drinking than working most days. I need somebody who can run a kitchen, manage a garden, keep a house in order. Somebody who isn't afraid of work that doesn't show results right away." He paused. "I'm offering you the position, room, board, fair wage, and your birds are welcome to come along. I've got coop space going unused." Delaney stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "You don't know if I can cook, can't keep a garden, can't do half what you're asking. I watched you spend your last money on creatures nobody else wanted, and then carry them home without complaining once about the weight." Rowan's voice didn't waver. "That tells me plenty." "It might tell you I'm a fool." "Might," he allowed. "I've been called worse for less." Delaney looked at the leaning porch behind her, at the garden gone to ruin, at the roof that wouldn't survive another hard winter without money. She didn't have to fix it. She looked at the coop where 11 broken birds had found, for the first time in their miserable existence, somewhere soft to land. "Why me?" she said again, and this time it wasn't an accusation. It was just a question, honest and a little afraid of the answer. Rowan considered it. "Because I think you understand something most people in this valley have forgotten," he said. "That broken doesn't mean finished, just means it needs somebody willing to do the work of fixing it." He paused. "Ranch needs that kind of understanding right now. So do I, if I'm honest about it." The admission cost him something. Delaney could see that. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way he looked off toward the mountains instead of at her when he said it. "I'll need a day," she said, "to think on it." "Take 2 if you need them." He climbed back up onto his wagon. "Pass is hard going once the weather turns, so don't take too long deciding, but I'm not going anywhere either way." He left her standing in the dusk outside her father's falling down house, the smell of the mountains still clinging to where he'd been sitting on the wagon bench, and Delaney stood there a long time after the sound of his wheels had faded, looking at her crate of broken hens settling into straw for the first peaceful night of their lives. She thought about Red Hollow, about the laughter that had followed her since she was a girl, about the way the town had decided who she was before she'd ever had the chance to decide for herself. She thought about a quiet man with grief sitting behind his eyes, offering her a chance nobody else in the valley would have thought to offer, for reasons that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with something harder to name. She didn't need 2 days. She knew by morning. The morning she left, Red Hollow turned out to watch, same as it always did when there was a show to be had. Word had gotten around fast. Word always did in a town that small, that bored, that hungry, for something to talk about that wasn't the weather or the price of grain. Delaney Cross was leaving town, going to work for the widower Ashcroft, up at his place past Brennan's Pass. Taking her broken chickens with her, if you could believe it, like she meant to keep the joke going even after she'd left earshot of it. "Bet she don't last the month," somebody said, loud enough to carry, as Delaney loaded the last of her few possessions into the back of the borrowed cart she'd arranged to get her things up the mountain. "Bet Ashcroft don't last the month, having her underfoot," somebody else answered, and there was laughter at that too, the same easy, cruel laughter that had followed her through every year of her life in this town. Delaney didn't turn around to face it. She'd learned that lesson well enough by now. She loaded the crate of hens last, careful with each one, checking the splint Rowan had helped her fashion the night before for the hen with the bad foot. The bird had stopped fighting against it sometime in the night, like even broken creatures could learn, given half a chance, that not every hand reaching toward them meant harm. "You're really doing this," said Marta Lindqvist, the one person in Red Hollow who'd never quite joined in the mockery, even if she'd never quite stood against it either. She stood by the cart with her arms crossed against the morning chill, watching Delaney work. Going up to that ranch, living with a man you barely know. I'm going to work for him, Delaney corrected. There's a difference. Folks'll say what they're going to say regardless. Folks always do. Delaney checked the latch on the crate one more time. Doesn't mean I have to listen anymore. Marta studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Not quite envy, not quite worry, something closer to recognition. Your mother would have understood this, going where you're wanted instead of staying where you're tolerated. The mention of her mother caught Delaney off guard, same as it always did. Adeline Cross had been gone 12 years now, and the town rarely spoke her name except in the careful, sideways way people spoke about things they didn't fully understand and had decided not to ask about. You knew her, Delaney said. It wasn't quite a question. Knew her some. Different times, mostly. Marta's expression shuttered closed, the way it always did whenever the subject of Adeline Cross came up. Like there was a door there that hadn't been opened in over a decade, and Marta had no intention of being the one to open it. You take care up there, Delaney. Mountain winters aren't kind to the unprepared. I'll manage. I expect you will. Marta hesitated, then added quieter. Your mother managed plenty, when she had to, before Delaney could ask what that meant, and there was something in it, some weight Marta hadn't intended to let slip. The older woman had already turned and walked back toward town, leaving Delaney standing beside her cart with more questions than she'd had 5 minutes earlier. She didn't have time to chase the thought down. The cart driver, a taciturn man named Olafson, who hauled freight up and down the mountain roads for whoever could pay him, was already climbing up onto his bench, impatient to get moving before the morning got any later. You riding up front or back with the birds? He asked. Back, Delaney said. Somebody ought to keep them calm on the climb. Olafson shrugged like it made no difference to him either way, and Delaney climbed into the back of the cart, settling herself among her few crates of belongings and the coop full of hens who'd weathered their first peaceful night in longer than any of them could remember. As the cart rolled out of Red Hollow, past the auction yard where she'd been laughed at the day before, past the church she'd never been welcome at despite never missing a service, past the general store where the owner had a habit of charging her extra and pretending it was an honest mistake, Delaney didn't look back. She watched the mountains instead, rising up gray and serious in the morning light, and she let herself feel something she hadn't allowed in a long time. Hope. Small and unfamiliar, and a little bit terrifying, but hope, all the same. The road to Rowan Ashcroft's ranch climbed steady through pine forest and switchback turns, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile, until Red Hollow felt like it belonged to a different season entirely, a different life Delaney was shedding one wheel rut at a time. She didn't know yet what waited for her at the top of that climb. Didn't know about the ranch hands who'd take one look at her and decide, same as the town always had, that she didn't belong. Didn't know about Rowan's late wife Esther's voice still echoing through every room of that farmhouse, or the dying garden, or the supplies running thinner each season. Rowan tried to manage the place alone. Didn't know about a man named Gideon Rusk, down in the valley, who controlled the livestock trade through fear and false ledgers and a network of debts he'd manufactured out of nothing. A man who'd eventually look at Delaney Cross and see, before anyone else did, exactly what kind of threat she'd become. Didn't know that her mother's name, Adeline Cross, carried a secret the whole valley had conspired to forget. A secret that would surface again before this was over and change how Red Hollow remembered every Cross who'd ever lived there. All Delaney knew, riding up that mountain road with 11 broken chickens clucking soft behind her, was that for the first time since she was a girl, somebody had looked at her and seen something worth building rather than something worth mocking. It would have to be enough, for now. The cart rounded a final bend, and the ranch came into view below the tree line, sprawling, weathered, half its outbuildings in disrepair, smoke curling thin from the farmhouse chimney into a sky gone the color of old iron. It didn't look like much, but Delaney Cross had never needed much to start with. She'd built her whole life out of scraps other people had thrown away. She figured she could build this too. The cart rolled into the yard just as a tall, lanky ranch hand stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped dead at the sight of her. "Well, look what the boss dragged home," he said, loud enough for the other two men by the corral to hear him. Didn't know we were running a charity now. Delaney climbed down from the cart without answering, her boots sinking into mud still soft from yesterday's rain. The ranch hand, lean-faced, maybe 30, with the kind of permanent smirk that came from never having to work hard for anyone's approval, looked her up and down the way men in Red Hollow always had, cataloging every reason she didn't belong. "Name's Delaney Cross," she said. "I'll be running the kitchen and the house." "Will you now?" He glanced over at the other two hands, a stocky older man and a younger one who couldn't have been more than 19, both of them grinning like they'd already decided how this story was going to go. "Ashcroft tell you what happened to the last woman who tried running this place?" "No, he didn't. She lasted 6 weeks. The lanky one, Delaney would learn his name was Cyrus Tate soon enough, and wish she hadn't, spat into the mud near her boots. Not quite at her, but close enough to make the point. House eats people whole. Gardens cursed. Cattle don't take to strangers." "Cattle don't take to anybody who smells like whiskey at noon, you mean?" Delaney said, before she could stop herself. The younger hand laughed, then caught himself when Cyrus shot him a look. Rowan came around the side of the barn just then, drawn by the voices, and the change in the yard was immediate. Cyrus's smirk didn't disappear exactly, but it folded itself down into something smaller, more careful. "Tate," Rowan said, "you got chores or you planning to stand around all morning making yourself useful with your mouth?" "Just welcoming the new help, boss." "Welcome her by getting that fence mended before the herd finds the gap." Rowan's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. There was something in the flatness of it that did the work raising his voice would have done for another man. "Go on." Cyrus went, muttering something Delaney didn't catch and didn't ask after, and the other two hands drifted back to whatever they'd been doing before the cart pulled in, though she could feel their eyes following her all the way to the house. "They'll come around," Rowan said, helping her down the last of her crates. "Or they won't, and I'll find men who will. Either way, you don't answer to them. You answer to me, and I'm telling you now. The house and the kitchen are yours to run as you see fit." "That's a generous offer for a woman you've known one day. I told you already, I don't need to know you long to know what I saw yesterday." He set the last crate down by the porch steps, the one with her hens still murmuring inside it. "Come on, I'll show you the house before the weather turns. Storm's coming down off the peak by evening, looks like." The house was bigger than anything Delaney had ever lived in, and emptier than anything she'd ever imagined a home could feel like. It wasn't falling apart the way her father's house had been falling apart. Rowan kept the structure sound, the roof tight, the walls solid. But there was a hollowness to it that no amount of good carpentry could fix. Dust sat thick on shelves that should have been used daily. A woman's shawl still hung on a peg by the back door, faded now, like it had been there so long the color had started giving up. The kitchen had a cold, unused look to it. Pots hung neat on their hooks, but nothing simmering, nothing baking, no warmth coming off the stove at all. "Kitchen's through here," Rowan said, leading her past a parlor with furniture draped in sheets, like the room itself was in mourning. "Pantry's been running thin. I've been meaning to get into town for supplies, but—" He stopped himself, didn't finish the sentence. "But you've had other things on your mind," Delaney finished for him, gently. Something like that. She walked through the kitchen slow, taking inventory the way she'd learned to from years of stretching nothing into something back at her father's place. The shelves held flour gone slightly stale, a little salt pork, dried beans, not much else. The garden out the back window, when she looked, was worse than she'd expected. Weeds choking out whatever had been planted there once. The soil gone hard and gray like it hadn't been turned in 2 seasons. "That was Esther's garden," Rowan said, following her gaze. "She had a gift for it. Things grew for her that wouldn't grow for anybody else, I swear it." He paused. "I haven't had the heart to touch it since." Delaney understood that kind of grief. The kind that made you protect the wreckage of something rather than clear it away, because clearing it away felt like a second death. She'd felt the same way about her mother's old recipe book for years after Adeline died. Kept it on a shelf gathering dust rather than risk cooking from it and getting something wrong, getting it different from how her mother would have made it. "I won't disturb what you don't want disturbed," she said, "but if you're willing, I think that garden could come back. Soil's not dead, just neglected. There's a difference." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his tired eyes. "You said something like that yesterday, too," he said, "about broken things." "I believe it. About gardens and chickens both. She met his gaze steady. Don't know yet if I believe it about people. Working on that part. A faint, rare thing happened then. The corner of Rowan's mouth twitched up. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count as one for a man who clearly hadn't practiced the expression in a while. Get settled in, he said. Room's upstairs, end of the hall. Storm will be here by supper, and I expect the hands will want something hot in their bellies when it hits, even if they won't say so polite. The storm came in hard that night, rattling the windows and turning the yard to thick mud, and Delaney spent the afternoon doing what she did best, making something out of almost nothing. She found enough in the pantry to put together a stew, thinned with extra water and thickened with the last of the dried beans. Seasoned, careful with what little salt pork remained, so the flavor stretched further than the ingredients should have allowed. She baked bread from the slightly stale flour, working the dough longer than necessary, like the kneading itself could fix what time had done to it. By the time the hands came stamping in out of the rain, shaking water off their hats, the kitchen smelled like something that hadn't filled that house in longer than Delaney wanted to guess. Cyrus Tate stopped in the doorway, sniffing the air with open suspicion, like good cooking was some kind of trick being played on him. Smells decent enough, he admitted, like the words cost him something. Sit down before it goes cold, Delaney said. Won't taste better for you standing there judging it. The older hand, a heavy-set man named Burl Hagen, who Delaney would come to learn had worked this ranch since before Esther died, and who carried his own quiet grief about the place that he never spoke on, sat first and took his first bite, and went still in a way that made the whole table pause. Lord, he said, then caught himself, glanced apologetically at nothing in particular, like the word had slipped out of habit rather than meaning. This is real good. It's stew, Cyrus said, sitting down across from him, skeptical. Can't be that. He took a bite, stopped talking. The young one, whose name Delaney learned was Wesley, just ate without commentary, 3 helpings deep before anybody noticed he hadn't said a word the whole meal, just kept eating like a man who hadn't realized how hungry he'd been until somebody finally fed him properly. Rowan, sitting at the head of the table, didn't say much either, but Delaney noticed him watching the room, watching his hands eat a real meal in his kitchen for what was probably the first time in years, watching the color come up warm in a space that had been cold and empty since his wife died. And something in his face, just for a second, looked less like a man carrying a weight and more like a man who'd set part of it down. Where'd you learn to cook like this? Burl asked, working on his second bowl. My mother taught me what she could before she passed, Delaney said. Rest I figured out on my own, mostly out of necessity. When you don't have much, you learn to make the little you have count. Well, you've got more here than you had wherever you came from, looks like, Cyrus said, though there was less edge in it now than there'd been that morning. Pantry's thin, but it's something. Pantry won't stay thin, Delaney said. Not if you're willing to lend a hand getting that garden turned over come morning, storm permitting. Cyrus looked at her like she'd grown a second head. Garden's dead. Has been for 2 years. Garden's not dead, it's neglected. Different thing entirely. She met his skeptical look without flinching. Same as those chickens I brought with me. Same as most things, I'd wager, given the chance and somebody willing to put in the work. Burl glanced toward Rowan like he was waiting for the boss to weigh in to put a stop to whatever foolishness the new hire was proposing. But Rowan just nodded, slow. Do as she asks, he said. Garden's been sitting fallow too long anyhow. Cyrus muttered something under his breath about taking orders from the cook now, but he didn't argue further, and Delaney counted that as a small victory. The first of many she'd need to win in this house before anybody truly believed she belonged in it. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Delaney hadn't known she'd been hungry for her whole life. She woke before dawn to tender hens first, checking the splint on the lame one, a bird she'd started calling Patch, mostly to herself, mostly because naming something made it harder to think of it as disposable. The hen had taken to her, in the strange, unhurried way animals sometimes attach themselves to the person who saved them, following her around the coop on its mending leg, clucking soft complaints whenever Delaney left its sight for too long. Then the kitchen, then the garden, then whatever needed doing in the house that day. Mending, scrubbing, hauling water, the endless quiet labor of making a place livable again after years of being merely maintained. The garden came back slower than she'd hoped, but it came back. She turned the soil herself at first, before Wesley started showing up unannounced in the mornings to help, never saying much, just working alongside her in companionable silence that suited them both. Burl brought her seed he'd been hoarding from better years, said he figured it was time somebody used it instead of letting it go stale in a jar. Even Cyrus, grudging and complaining the whole while, helped haul manure from the barn to work into the dirt, claiming the whole time that it was beneath him, and he was only doing it because Rowan told him to. "You don't have to keep saying that," Delaney told him one afternoon, both of them on their knees in the dirt, working compost into a row meant for carrots. "Nobody's keeping count of how much you're enjoying it." "I ain't enjoying it." "Sure, I'm not." He glared at her, but there wasn't real heat in it anymore. Hadn't been for a couple weeks now. Not since the stew. Not since she'd started leaving an extra biscuit on his plate without being asked, because she'd noticed he ate like a man who'd gone hungry plenty in his life and never quite trusted that the food would keep coming. "I just don't like watching things sit useless when they could be doing something." "That's most of what I believe too," Delaney said. "It just took you longer to say it out loud." Cyrus didn't answer that, but he kept working, and that was answer enough. The chickens, meanwhile, were doing something nobody in that ranch yard had expected. Patch's leg had healed straighter than Delaney dared hope, and the bird had started moving with something close to confidence. Scratching in the dirt alongside the healthy birds Rowan already kept, holding her own despite the limp that would never fully disappear. The blind hen, Delaney had named her Clover, for no reason she could explain except that the name had felt right, had learned the layout of the coop and yard so thoroughly that her blindness barely slowed her down at all, navigating by memory and the sound of the other birds around her. And one morning, 6 weeks into Delaney's time at the ranch, she went out to the coop to find an egg sitting in Clover's nest box. She stood there a long moment, just looking at it, feeling something well up in her chest that she hadn't expected and didn't entirely have words for. "That bird wasn't supposed to lay again," Burl said, when she brought the egg into the kitchen, set it on the table like it was something precious, which to her, it was. "Pratt told everybody at the auction those hens were past laying. Said it himself." "Pratt was wrong," Delaney said, "or he didn't bother finding out. Easier to call something worthless than to ask why it stopped trying." Within the week, 3 more of the broken hens had started laying. Not steady yet, not reliable, but laying, which was 3 more eggs than anyone in that yard had expected to see from birds that had been sold for $2 as a joke nobody thought would pay off. Rowan came out to the coop himself to see it, stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the eggs Delaney had collected, looking at the hens scratching around in the dirt with more life in them than they'd shown in the crate at auction. "I knew you'd manage something with them," he said. "Didn't expect it to be this fast." "They just needed somebody to believe they were worth the trouble," Delaney said. "Same as most things." Rowan looked at her then, a long, searching look that made Delaney's pulse pick up in a way she wasn't fully prepared for, wasn't sure what to do with. "Same as most things," he agreed, quiet. Neither of them said anything else about it, but something had shifted there in the coop doorway, something neither one of them had words ready for yet, and they both walked back toward the house a little more careful with the silence between them than they'd been before. Word of what was happening at the Ashcroft Ranch took longer to reach Red Hollow than either Delaney or Rowan expected, but it reached eventually, the way all news did in a valley too small to keep secrets for long. It reached Gideon Rusk first, as most useful information in that valley tended to. Gideon ran the livestock trade through Red Hollow, and 3 other towns scattered along the valley floor had run it for going on 15 years, ever since he'd bought out Old Pratt's predecessor and started building what he liked to call his network, a tangle of debts and favors and carefully managed information that meant nearly every rancher in the valley owed him something, one way or another, whether they fully understood it yet or not. He was a tall man, handsome in the way that men who'd never had to work with their hands stayed handsome, with a smile that worked like a tool rather than an expression of anything he actually felt. He kept ledgers in a back room of his office that didn't match the ledgers he showed anyone else, and he'd built an entire fortune on the gap between those 2 sets of numbers. He'd been the one to humiliate Delaney Cross at that auction, in his own way. Not directly. He never did anything directly that he could arrange someone else to do for him, but Pratt worked auctions on Gideon's say-so, same as half the merchants in town, and Gideon had made sure for years that the Cross name carried a particular flavor of contempt through Red Hollow. Ever since Adeline Cross had crossed him over something he'd never fully explained to anyone and had no intention of explaining now. So when word reached him that the broken hens Delaney Cross had bought as a joke were laying eggs, were thriving, were the talk of ranch hands who came down from the mountain for supplies and couldn't stop talking about the stew that woman cooked and the garden she'd brought back from the dead, Gideon didn't laugh the way Red Hollow had laughed at the auction. He went very still and very quiet and started thinking. She's working for Ashcroft now, his clerk, a nervous young man named Petrie, told him, relaying the gossip he'd picked up from a supply run. Folks say the ranch is doing better than it has since his wife passed. Hands are eating good. Garden's coming back. Even talk of the cattle doing better, though I don't know how a cook would account for that. Ashcroft's debt, Gideon said, not looking up from the ledger in front of him. Where does that stand? Petrie checked his notes, flipping pages with the careful nervousness of a man who knew his employer didn't tolerate mistakes. Behind on the note from last winter's feed purchase. Not far behind. Few months, maybe, before it'd be worth pressing. Press it sooner. Sir? Gideon looked up then, and Petrie went still under that gaze the way most people did. I said press it sooner. Find a reason if there isn't one ready-made. A man distracted by a woman in his kitchen isn't watching his books close enough to notice if the numbers shift a little against him. Gideon's smile came back, thin and practiced. And if that woman starts thinking she's built something worth being proud of up there, I'd like the chance to remind this valley exactly what a cross is worth before she gets too comfortable believing otherwise. He didn't explain what he meant by that. Not to Petrie, not to anyone. The history between Gideon Rusk and the Cross family ran deeper than auction day cruelty, deeper than petty grudges over land or money, though it would be a while yet before Delaney learned exactly how deep, or exactly what her mother had done to earn Gideon's lasting hatred. For now, all Gideon needed was patience, and patience was a thing he had in abundance. He'd built his entire fortune on it, on waiting for people to overextend themselves, to trust the wrong numbers, to believe the wrong story about their own situation until it was too late to correct course. He intended to do the same thing to Rowan Ashcroft and the woman working in his kitchen. He just needed the right moment. That moment started building itself a few weeks later, on a supply run into Red Hollow that Delaney hadn't wanted to make but couldn't avoid. The ranch needed things the garden and the kitchen couldn't provide on their own. Sugar, coffee, certain spices, thread for mending, nails for the fence. Cyrus kept patching and repatching against a herd that seemed determined to test every weak point in it. Rowan offered to make the trip himself, but Delaney had insisted on going along, told him plain that she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life hiding from a town just because the town had given her reason to hide. You sure about this? Rowan asked as they loaded the wagon that morning. Town hasn't exactly been kind to you. Town's never been kind to me a day in my life, Delaney said. Doesn't mean I let it decide where I'm allowed to go. Rowan studied her for a moment, something like respect moving behind his tired eyes, and didn't argue further. The ride down the mountain felt different than the ride up had, weeks ago. Delaney sat up front this time, beside Rowan rather than in back with crated hens, and the silence between them had lost some of its careful distance. They talked some, about small things, about the ranch, about Patch and Clover, and the slow miracle of birds nobody believed in finding their footing again. Rowan laughed once, a short surprised sound, when Delaney told him about catching Cyrus talking softly to the chickens one morning when he thought nobody was around, telling them they'd better lay good eggs, or he'd have a hard time explaining to the boss why he was wasting his mornings babying poultry. Tate, talking to chickens? Rowan said, shaking his head. Man'd deny it to his grave. I won't tell if you won't. Deal. It was easy between them in a way Delaney hadn't expected easy to feel, hadn't experienced much of in her life at all, and she found herself wishing the ride into town could stretch out longer than it actually did. But Red Hollow came into view eventually, the way it always did, and the ease between them tightened back into something more careful as they rolled into the main street, and people started noticing who was riding beside Rowan Ashcroft on his wagon bench. Well, will you look at that? Somebody said, loud enough to carry, as Rowan pulled up outside the general store. Cross girls moved on up in the world. Delaney felt the old heat rise in her face, the old urge to shrink, but she made herself climb down from the wagon steady, made herself walk into that store with her chin level, same as she'd carried that crate of chickens out of the auction yard weeks before. The store owner, a thin, nervous man named Aldous Finch, who'd overcharged her for years and called it honest mistake, watched her come in with an expression Delaney couldn't quite read. Not the open contempt she was used to, but something more cautious. "Miss Cross," he said, "heard you were up at the Ashcroft place now." "That's right. Heard things are going well up there, garden and all." He said it carefully, like he was testing the words before he committed to them. "They are." Delaney started working through her list, gathering what she needed off the shelves while Finch hovered near the counter. "Word travels fast. This is a small valley, Miss Cross. Word travels however far it needs to." Finch hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I'd watch myself if I were you. Some folks don't care much for hearing that a Cross is doing well at anything. Some folks never have. This is different." Finch glanced toward the window, toward the street outside, like he was checking for someone before he continued. "Gideon Rusk's been asking after the Ashcroft account, asking close. That's not a man who asks questions without a reason behind them." Delaney went still, a list of dry goods forgotten in her hand. "What kind of reason?" "I couldn't say for certain, but I've seen him do this before, with other ranches that got too comfortable, too confident. Man builds his whole business on finding the moment somebody's not watching close enough, and then—" Finch made a small gesture, like something collapsing. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you, Miss Cross. I'm telling you because your mother did me a kindness once, a long time ago, and I never had the chance to return it before she passed." The mention of her mother again. The second time in a month somebody in this town had referenced Adeline Cross with that particular careful weight. Like there was a story there nobody wanted to be the one to tell. Sent a chill through Delaney that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "What kindness?" she asked. "What did my mother do? That everyone speaks of her like that?" But Finch's face had already closed up again, the way Marta's had weeks before, like he'd let slip more than he'd meant to and was scrambling to put the lid back on it. "That's not my story to tell," he said. "You ask your own questions when you're ready to hear the answers. For now, just watch yourselves up there. Both of you." He wouldn't say more than that, no matter how Delaney pressed, and she left the store that day with her supplies loaded and a knot of unease sitting heavy in her stomach that had nothing to do with anything she could yet name or fight. Rowan noticed it on the ride back, the quiet that had come over her, different from the easy quiet they'd shared on the way down. "Something happened in there," he said. "Finch said Gideon Rusk's been asking about your account. Close," he said, like a man looking for an excuse. Rowan's jaw tightened, just slightly, the only sign he gave that the name meant something to him too. "Rusk's been circling ranches in this valley for years, looking for weak spots in the books, ways to call debts due before a man's ready for it. He's done it before, to others. Took the Marsh place that way, 2 winters back." "Are we behind? On the feed note?" "A little, not enough that it should matter." But something in his voice carried less certainty than his words did, and Delaney heard it, filed it away alongside Finch's warning, alongside the strange weighted silence everyone in this valley seemed to carry whenever her mother's name came up. "There's something else too," she said. "Finch mentioned my mother, said she did him a kindness once, wouldn't say what." Rowan glanced at her, surprised. "Your mother?" "Marta said something similar the morning I left town. Said my mother managed plenty when she had to. Like there's a story everybody knows except me." Delaney stared out at the road ahead, at the mountains rising gray and patient in the distance. "I don't know what my mother did in this valley before she died. I was 12. Nobody ever told me anything except that she passed, and that the town never seemed to forgive her for whatever it was, even after she was gone." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, the wagon wheels grinding steady over the dirt road. "Whatever it is," he said finally, "you'll find it out eventually. Secrets in a valley this small don't stay buried forever. They just wait for the right pressure to come along and dig them up." He didn't know yet how right he was, how soon that pressure would come, or how much weight that long-buried secret would carry once it finally surfaced. Neither of them did. But the storm that had been building quietly in Gideon Rusk's back office, fed by old grudges, careful ledgers, and a patience 15 years in the making, was closer to breaking than either of them understood, and it was coming for both the ranch and the name Delaney Cross had spent her whole life trying to outrun. She just didn't know it yet. The pressure Rowan had spoken of arrived 3 weeks later, On a morning so ordinary that nobody at the ranch had any reason to expect their world was about to tilt sideways. Delaney was in the garden when the rider came, kneeling in a row of carrots that had finally come up thick and orange after months of coaxing, her hands black with good soil, when she heard the hoofbeats coming hard up the ranch road. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and watched a man she didn't recognize swing down off his horse in front of the house, a leather satchel under his arm, and an expression on his face that suggested he didn't enjoy whatever errand had brought him. "Looking for Rowan Ashcroft," the man said, when Rowan came out onto the porch at the sound of the commotion. "You found him?" "Name's Petrie. I work for Mr. Rusk's office in town." The man's eyes flicked toward Delaney, then away, like he didn't want to be caught looking. "I've got papers here regarding your outstanding note from the feed purchase last winter." "I'm aware of the note," Rowan said, his voice even, though Delaney saw the way his shoulders had gone tight. "I've been making payments against it." "You've been making partial payments against it. Mr. Rusk's calling the balance due in full, 30 days. Petrie pulled a folded paper from his satchel and held it out, not quite meeting Rowan's eyes as he did it. "Terms are all there. He's within his rights, given the original agreement." Rowan took the paper, unfolded it, and Delaney watched his face as he read, watched something harden behind his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. "This isn't the agreement I signed," he said. "Original terms gave me through next spring to clear the balance. That's not what's on file at Mr. Rusk's office." "Then somebody's file is wrong." Petrie shifted his weight, uncomfortable, a man clearly aware he was standing in the middle of something he didn't have the authority to fix. "I just deliver the papers, Mr. Ashcroft. You've got questions about the terms. You'll need to take them up with Mr. Rusk directly, 30 days. That's all I know." He swung back up onto his horse and rode off without waiting for further argument, leaving Rowan standing on the porch with a piece of paper that threatened to undo 3 years of slow, grinding work, and Delaney standing in the garden with dirt under her fingernails and a sick feeling spreading through her stomach. "How much?" she said, walking up to the porch. "How much is the balance?" "More than I can raise in 30 days. Not without selling stock I need for next season, and even then—" Rowan didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Delaney had grown up watching her father do the same kind of arithmetic in his head, the kind that never came out even, the kind that ended in a man drinking himself quiet at the kitchen table because the numbers wouldn't forgive him no matter how he turned them. "This is what Finch was warning us about," she said. "Rusk's been waiting for an excuse." "He didn't need an excuse. He made one." Rowan's jaw worked, anger sitting close under the surface of him in a way Delaney hadn't seen before, not in the weeks she'd known him. "I kept copies of every payment. I know what I signed. If his ledger says something different, then his ledger's wrong, and he knows it." "Can you prove it?" "I can prove what I paid. Whether that's enough to stand against whatever he's got written down in his own books." Rowan shook his head. "Rusk's been doing this to ranches in this valley for 15 years. Nobody's beaten him at it yet. Don't know why I'd be the first." Delaney looked at the paper in his hand, at the careful official language designed to sound unbeatable, and felt something stir in her that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere close to both. "Maybe nobody's beaten him because nobody's had reason enough to try hard," she said. "We have reason." The 30 days that followed tested every piece of the fragile, hard-won stability the ranch had built since Delaney's arrival. Rowan rode into town twice that first week, trying to get a straight answer out of Gideon Rusk's office, and came back both times with nothing but cold courtesy and paperwork that seemed to shift slightly every time he looked at it, like the numbers themselves were conspiring against him. Burl and Cyrus took on extra work without being asked, trying to squeeze whatever value they could out of the herd before any forced sale might come due. And even Wesley, usually content to work quiet and say little, started asking pointed questions about what would happen to all of them. To him, to Burl, to Cyrus, to the ranch hands who had nowhere else to go, if the place went under. "We won't let it come to that," Delaney told him one evening in the kitchen, though she wasn't sure yet how she intended to keep that promise. "You sound awful confident for somebody who's been here 2 months, Wesley said, not unkindly, just honest in the plain way 19-year-olds sometimes were. "I've been broke and desperate most of my life," Delaney said. "Doesn't mean I've learned how to lose. Just means I've learned how to keep fighting past the point most folks give up." It wasn't confidence so much as stubbornness, and she knew the difference. But she also knew which one was more useful right now, so she let Wesley believe it was the former. She started spending her evenings going through what records Rowan kept: receipts, old letters, anything that might help build a case against Rusk's claim that the ranch owed more than it actually did. It was slow, frustrating work, made harder by the fact that Esther had apparently kept the more detailed books, and nobody had touched her ledgers since she died. "They're in the trunk," Rowan told her. The third night Delaney asked about it, his voice gone quiet and careful in a way that told her exactly how much it cost him to say it. "Bedroom. Under the window. I haven't opened it since the funeral." "You don't have to be the one to open it," Delaney said. "I can, if you'd rather not." Rowan was quiet a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, the kind of stillness Delaney had learned meant he was wrestling with something too big to put words around easily. "No," he said finally. "I should be there. She kept those books careful. If anybody can find what we need in them, it's her work that'll show it." They went up together that night, and Rowan knelt in front of an old trunk Delaney hadn't noticed before, tucked under the window like he'd said, and opened it slow, like he was afraid of what memory might come pouring out along with the contents. What came out instead was paper, ledgers, receipts, careful handwriting in neat columns, years of meticulous record-keeping that told the story of a woman who'd loved this ranch enough to track every dollar that moved through it. "She used to do the books at this desk," Rowan said, running his hand along the edge of an old writing table near the window, his voice gone soft and far away. "Every Sunday evening. Said a ranch couldn't survive on hope alone, no matter how much either of us wanted it to." "She sounds like she was smart. Smarter than me, on the parts that mattered for keeping this place standing." He picked up one of the ledgers, turned it over in his hands like it was something fragile, something precious. "I used to tease her about it. Told her she worried too much over numbers that always came out fine in the end." "Did they come out fine?" "They did, when she was the one minding them." Something flickered across his face. Grief, yes, but something gentler underneath it too, the kind of memory that hurt and comforted at once. "I haven't been half as careful since." Delaney sat down beside him on the floor, the trunk open between them, and started sorting through pages, looking for anything that might match against the feed purchase, against the original terms of the note Rusk now claimed had never existed. It took them most of the night, working by lamplight, passing pages back and forth, but eventually Delaney found it. A receipt, dated and signed, matching the original terms Rowan remembered, the terms that gave him until next spring rather than 30 days to clear the balance. "Here," she said, holding it up, her voice catching with the relief of it. "This matches what you told Petrie. If this is genuine and Rusk's copy says something different, then somebody altered something, somewhere along the way." Rowan took the receipt, studied it close, his hands not quite steady. "This is Esther's hand. She copied the terms down herself the day we signed." "Then we take it to him. Show him the proof. Rusk won't care about proof. Not if it's inconvenient to his own numbers. Man like that, he's spent 15 years making sure his version of events is the one folks believe, regardless of what's actually true." Rowan set the receipt down careful, like it might shatter. "But it's a start. Maybe the only start we've got." Gideon Rusk's office sat at the center of Red Hollow's business district, a building nicer than anything else on the street, paid for, though nobody said it out loud, by the slow accumulation of other people's misfortune. Delaney insisted on coming along when Rowan rode down to confront him directly, and Rowan didn't argue, though she could tell some part of him would have preferred to spare her whatever ugliness was coming. "You don't owe him anything," Rowan said, as they tied up their horses outside the office. "If you'd rather wait—" "I'm not waiting outside while a man tries to take everything you've built," Delaney said. "Not after everything that ranch has given me a chance at. I'm coming in." Gideon received them in his office with the kind of practiced cordiality that made Delaney's skin prickle the moment she walked through the door. A smile too smooth, eyes too calculating, the demeanor of a man who'd long ago learned that pleasantness was simply another tool for getting what he wanted. "Mr. Ashcroft. And Miss Cross." His eyes lingered on her a beat longer than comfortable. "I'd heard you'd found work up at the ranch. Quite the change in fortune for a Cross." "I came about the note," Rowan said, not engaging with whatever bait Gideon was dangling. "The terms Petrie delivered don't match what I signed. They match what's in my ledgers." "Then your ledgers are wrong." Rowan set Esther's receipt down on the desk between them, careful, deliberate. This is dated the same day as the original agreement. Shows the terms as through next spring, not 30 days. Gideon barely glanced at the paper before pushing it back across the desk. Documents can be written up after the fact, Mr. Ashcroft, when a man's desperate enough to need them to say something different than what actually happened. My wife wrote that the day we signed, 3 years ago, long before there was any reason to falsify anything. So you say. Gideon's smile didn't waver. I'm afraid my records are what stand, in the absence of anything more compelling than a dead woman's handwriting that nobody else can verify. The casual cruelty of it, invoking Esther's death like it was simply one more inconvenient detail to be dismissed, made something in Rowan's expression go dangerous in a way Delaney hadn't seen from him before, and she found herself stepping slightly forward, a hand coming to rest on his arm, not to hold him back exactly, but to remind him that losing his temper here would only give Gideon more ammunition. "You knew my mother," Delaney said, before she'd fully decided to say it, the words pulling themselves up out of some instinct she didn't fully understand yet. "Adeline Cross. Everyone in this valley speaks her name like it's a secret nobody's allowed to explain to me. What did she do that you've spent 12 years making sure her daughter inherits the shame of it?" Something shifted in Gideon's face then. Quick, almost imperceptible, but Delaney had spent her whole life reading the small cracks in people's careful expressions, and she caught it. "Your mother," Gideon said, voice gone tight and controlled, "made choices that cost people in this valley a great deal. I'd think carefully before you go digging up ground better left settled, Miss Cross. Some truths don't do anybody favors once they're aired." That sounds like a threat. It's a kindness. One cross woman to the next, you might say. His smile came back thin and cold. "Now, regarding the note, 30 days remains the term. I'd suggest you spend that time finding the money rather than chasing ghosts, Mr. Ashcroft. Ghosts don't pay debts." They left his office with nothing resolved, the receipt useless against a man who simply refused to acknowledge it, and the 30 days ticking steadily closer to a deadline neither of them could see a clear way past. But Delaney carried something else out of that office besides frustration and fear for the ranch. She carried the certainty, solid and sharpening with every mile back up the mountain, that whatever her mother had done all those years ago, it had frightened Gideon Rusk badly enough that he still couldn't speak her name without his careful composure slipping. She intended to find out why. The answer came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks before the deadline, when Marta Lindqvist made the long ride up to the ranch herself, something Delaney hadn't expected the older woman to ever do. "I heard about the note," Marta said, sitting at the kitchen table while Delaney poured coffee for them both, her hands wrapped tight around the cup like she needed something solid to hold on to. "Whole valley's heard by now. Rusk doesn't move quiet when he's closing in on something." "You rode all this way to tell me that?" "I rode all this way because I should have told you the truth a long time ago, and I kept finding reasons not to, and now it might cost you and Ashcroft both more than I'm willing to live with if I keep staying quiet." Marta took a long breath, the kind that came before something difficult. "Your mother didn't just manage during the famine winter, Delaney. She saved this valley, all of it, and Gideon Rusk has spent 12 years making sure nobody remembers it that way." Delaney sat down slowly across from her. "Tell me, winter of the famine, your mother had nothing, same as the rest of us, but she had a gift for stretching what little there was. Same gift you've got, looks like, if half what I hear about that ranch kitchen is true." Marta's eyes had gone distant, pulled back into memory. She organized the whole valley, got families sharing what they had instead of hoarding it, talked ranchers into pooling stock instead of letting their neighbors starve out of spite or competition, saved dozens of lives that winter, probably more. Then why does nobody speak of it? Why does my name carry shame instead of gratitude? Marta's jaw tightened. Because Gideon Rusk was buying up desperate land that winter, cheap, off families who thought they were going to starve. Your mother's work meant fewer families desperate enough to sell, cost him a fortune in land he never got his hands on. She paused. When the worst of it passed, Rusk started a different kind of story. Said Adeline had been hoarding supplies herself, doling them out to favorites, letting others go without. Twisted the whole truth backward. Folks were tired and scared and looking for somebody to blame for the winter being hard at all, and Rusk gave them a target. And everyone believed him. Everyone wanted to believe somebody, and he made it easy. By the time your mother could have fought it properly, she was already sick. The same illness that took her a year later, never had the strength left to clear her own name. Marta's eyes were wet now, old grief surfacing alongside old guilt. I should have spoken up. Plenty of us should have. We knew the truth and let the lie stand because fighting Rusk felt like more trouble than defending a dying woman's reputation was worth. That's the kind of cowardice this valley's been living with for 12 years, and I'm sick to death of carrying my piece of it. Delaney sat with that for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her. Grief for a mother she'd lost too young to ever properly know. Anger at a town that had let a lie replace the truth simply because the truth was inconvenient. And underneath both of those, something that felt almost like vindication, like a missing piece of herself finally sliding into place. "Why tell me now?" she said. "Because Rusk's circling your ranch the same way he circled this valley 12 years ago. Finding the moment somebody's vulnerable, then twisting the story until cruelty looks like justice." Marta reached across the table, gripped Delaney's hand with surprising strength. "You're your mother's daughter, whether this valley ever admits it or not. If anybody can do what she couldn't, clear the name properly, beat that man at his own game, it's you. But you'll need more than one old woman's guilty conscience to do it. You'll need proof." "What kind of proof?" "Records. Rusk's real records, not the ones he shows folks." Marta's expression hardened with old anger finally given somewhere useful to go. "There's talk, has been for years, that he keeps 2 sets of books. One for show, one for truth. If that's real, and if somebody could get their hands on it, it would prove what he did to my mother, and what he's trying to do to Rowan now." "It would prove a lot more than that, I'd wager. Man's been running this valley on fear and false numbers for 15 years. I doubt your ranch is the only place he's squeezed dry." Delaney looked at the ledgers still stacked on the kitchen counter, Esther's careful handwriting visible on the topmost page, and felt the shape of something forming in her mind. Dangerous, uncertain, but the first real path forward she'd seen since Petrie rode up that ranch road with papers meant to take everything Rowan had built. "I need to find those real records," she said, "before the 30 days run out. That won't be easy. Rusk doesn't leave that kind of thing lying around for just anybody to find." "No," Delaney agreed, "but I imagine my mother didn't find it easy either. Organizing a starving valley against its own fear doesn't mean she didn't do it." Marta looked at her for a long moment, something like pride breaking through the old grief on her face. "No," she said, "it doesn't." Delaney told Rowan everything that night, sitting in the kitchen long after the hands had gone to bed, the lamp burning low between them while she relayed what Marta had told her, watched his face move through surprise and anger and something gentler underneath both. "Your mother saved this valley," he said when she'd finished, "and Rusk turned it into a reason to mock you instead. 12 years of it, the whole town complicit, one way or another, in letting the lie stand because the truth was inconvenient for the man holding their debts." Delaney's hands were steady around her coffee cup, but her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before that conversation with Marta. "I want to find his real ledgers, Rowan. The ones that would show what he's actually been doing to this valley. Not just for my mother's sake, for yours too. For Burl and Cyrus and Wesley and every family in this valley, he's been quietly bleeding for 15 years. That's dangerous ground. Man like Rusk doesn't take kindly to having his secrets dug up. Man like Rusk has had 15 years of nobody brave enough to dig." Delaney met his eyes steady across the table. "I'm not asking you to risk the ranch on a hunch. I'm asking whether you're willing to risk it on the truth if I can find it in time." Rowan was quiet a long moment, studying her with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the past weeks from cautious respect into something warmer, something that made Delaney's pulse pick up every time she caught it directed her way. "I watched you walk into an auction yard and buy creatures everybody else had given up on," he said finally, "and turn them into something nobody expected. I think I'd be a fool to doubt you now, just because the stakes have gotten bigger." "They've gotten a great deal bigger." "Then we'd best get started." He reached across the table, covered her hand with his, warm and certain in a way that settled something nervous and uncertain in Delaney's chest. 30 days. Whatever it takes, we use every one of them." Outside, the mountain wind picked up against the windows, carrying the first hard edge of a winter that was coming, whether the ranch was ready for it or not. And somewhere down in the valley, Gideon Rusk slept easy in a house built on other people's misfortune, with no idea yet that the daughter of the one woman who'd ever truly threatened his careful empire of lies was awake at that very hour, planning exactly how she intended to bring the whole thing down. The plan that took shape over the next several days was nowhere near as clean as Delaney would have liked, but desperate timelines didn't leave much room for clean. "We can't just walk into his office and ask to see his private ledgers," Rowan said, the morning after their conversation, pacing the kitchen while Delaney worked dough on the counter, needing something to do with her hands while her mind worked the problem from every angle. "Man's not foolish enough to leave that kind of thing sitting where anybody could find it." "No, but he's not the only one who knows where it's kept." Delaney kept her eyes on the dough, kneading steady. "Petrie works in that office every day. Young, nervous, looked plenty uncomfortable delivering those papers to you. You think he'd help us against his own employer?" "I think a man who looked that sick about his job might be persuaded, if the right argument came along." Delaney glanced up. "Worth finding out anyway. We don't have many other doors to knock on." Finding Petrie alone took some doing. The man kept close to Gideon's office most days, and Gideon wasn't the sort of employer who left his people much room to wander off on personal business. But Delaney caught him on a Sunday, the one day Gideon's office stood empty, when Petrie slipped into the back pew at the Red Hollow Chapel, like a man seeking something he couldn't quite name even to himself. She waited until he came out, the small crowd thinning toward their Sunday dinners, and fell into step beside him on the walk back toward town center. "Mr. Petrie," he startled, then composed himself, the careful nervousness she remembered from the ranch road settling back over his features. "Miss Cross, I didn't expect—" "I imagine you didn't. I won't take much of your time." She kept her voice even, unthreatening. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand I'm not asking it to get you in trouble. I'm asking because I think you might already be troubled by some of what you've seen in that office, and maybe you've been looking for a reason to do something about it." Petrie's jaw tightened, and he glanced around them, checking for anyone close enough to overhear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Delaney kept walking, kept her pace easy, giving him room to think rather than crowding him into a corner. "The papers you delivered to Rowan's ranch, were those terms accurate, the 30 days? Or did something change between what was originally signed and what you carried up that mountain?" "I told you, I just deliver what Mr. Rusk gives me." "That's not a no." Petrie stopped walking, and for a long moment he just stood there on the empty street, something working behind his careful, frightened eyes. "He keeps 2 books, Petrie said finally, voice dropped almost to nothing. "I've known for 2 years now. Real numbers in one, the numbers he shows folks in the other. I've watched him alter terms after the fact more times than I can count on 2 hands. Watched him take the Marsh place that way. The Calloway place, too, before that." "Why haven't you said anything? And tell who?" Petrie's laugh came out bitter, humorless. "Town magistrate owes Rusk money on his own note. Sheriff's cousin works in that very office, drawing wages Rusk pays him for looking the other way. There's nowhere to take a complaint that doesn't run straight back to him one way or another." He shook his head. "I need this job, Miss Cross. I've got a mother to support, same as anybody. Speaking up costs me everything, and changes nothing besides." "It could change something if the proof was solid enough that it couldn't be buried." Delaney kept her voice steady, kept the desperation she felt out of it as best she could. "I'm not asking you to march into the magistrate's office and accuse him outright. I'm asking if there's any way at all, to get a look at that second ledger. Just a look. Enough to know what's Jen really written there about the Ashcroft note, about my mother's old debts, about whatever else he's been hiding for 15 years. Petrie was quiet a long time, the kind of silence that comes before a person commits to something they've spent a long while avoiding. "He goes to Castleton on business, end of next week," he said finally. "Overnight trip, every quarter, regular as clockwork. Office sits empty that night except for me, closing up." He met her eyes, and Delaney saw real fear there, but underneath it, something steadier too. "I'm not promising anything, but if a person happened to find the back office unlocked that particular night, and happened to know where a certain drawer was kept, I couldn't be held responsible for what somebody else chose to do with information they weren't supposed to have. That's a kindness, Mr. Petrie, one I won't forget. Don't thank me yet. If this goes wrong, it goes wrong for both of us. And I've got less to fall back on than you might think. He started walking again, faster now, eager to put distance between himself and this conversation. End of next week. I'll leave word on which night, once I know for certain. He disappeared around the corner before Delaney could say anything else, and she stood there a moment in the quiet Sunday street, feeling the shape of a plan finally solidifying into something with real edges, real risk, real possibility. Baked. The week that followed felt longer than any week Delaney had lived through, the ranch's normal rhythm continuing underneath a tension that had settled into every conversation, every silence, every glance Rowan and Delaney exchanged across the kitchen table. Burl and Cyrus knew something was wrong, even without being told the particulars. The ranch hands weren't fools, and 30 days against a debt note wasn't the kind of pressure that stayed hidden in a house this small. "You gonna tell us what's going on?" Cyrus asked one evening, blunt as ever. "Or are we just supposed to keep mending fence and pretend we don't notice the boss looking like he hasn't slept right in 2 weeks? Rowan glanced at Delaney, a silent question passing between them, and she nodded slightly. These men had earned the truth, had worked themselves raw, trying to shore up whatever they could against a threat they didn't fully understand. "Rusk's trying to force the ranch into default," Rowan said. "Altered the terms on my feed note, says I owe the full balance in 30 days instead of through next spring like I signed for." "Son of a—" Burl caught himself, glanced apologetically toward Delaney out of old habit, then apparently decided the situation didn't call for manners. "Bastard's been doing that to ranches up and down this valley for years. Took my cousin's place that way, back before I came to work here." "We know," Delaney said. "We're working on proof against him. Real proof, not just Rowan's word against his ledger." "What kind of proof?" Wesley asked, looking between the three of them with the wide, serious eyes of a young man finally being let in on something that mattered. Delaney hesitated, then decided these men deserved the whole truth, not a careful version trimmed down for their comfort. "Russ keeps 2 sets of books. We've got a way to see the real one, end of this week. If it shows what we think it'll show, it could prove what he's done to this ranch, and to my mother's name 12 years back, and probably to half the families in this valley besides." The kitchen went quiet for a moment, the weight of what she'd said settling over all of them. "That's a hell of a risk," Cyrus said finally. "Man finds out somebody's been through his private papers. He won't just call in a debt note. He'll come at you with everything he's got." "I know. And you're still doing it." "I am." Delaney met his eyes steady. "Because the alternative is letting him win the same way he's won every other time he's done this. Letting good people lose everything because nobody was willing to risk enough to stop him." Cyrus studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his usual hard expression. "Respect, maybe. Or something close enough to it." "Then I reckon you'll need somebody watching your back while you do it," he said. "Whatever this plan is, count me in." "Same," Wesley said immediately. Burl just nodded, no words needed, and Delaney felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear this time, but something warmer, something like the feeling of standing in a kitchen full of people who'd chosen freely and without being asked twice to stand beside her. The night Petrie had marked finally arrived, cold and clear. The kind of mountain night where every sound carried further than it should, and every shadow seemed to hold more weight than usual. Delaney rode down with Rowan, the 2 of them alone this time. Too many riders coming into town after dark would draw exactly the kind of attention they couldn't afford. Cyrus and the others stayed behind, ready if word needed to reach the ranch fast, but this part of the plan belonged to just the 2 of them. Petrie was waiting near the back entrance of Gideon's office, looking sicker with nerves than Delaney had seen him yet, glancing up and down the empty street like he expected Gideon himself to materialize out of the darkness, despite being clear across the valley in Castleton. "Door's unlocked," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Back room, 2nd drawer on the left side of the desk. False bottom. You'll have to feel for the catch. It's not obvious unless you know to look. I've got to be seen at the front counter, in case anybody passes by and wonders why the lamp's burning. I can't be caught back there with you." "Understood," Rowan said. "We won't be long." "You'd better not be, if Russ gets back early." "He won't," Delaney said, with more confidence than she fully felt. "We checked the Castleton stage schedule. Earliest he could return is tomorrow noon. Petrie nodded, still looking ill about the whole arrangement, and disappeared toward the front of the building, leaving Rowan and Delaney to slip through the back door into the dim, papered quiet of Gideon Rusk's private office. The back room was smaller than Delaney expected, cramped with filing cabinets and a heavy oak desk that looked like it had cost more than most ranch houses in the valley. Rowan found the second drawer on the left, exactly where Petrie had said, and ran his fingers along the underside until something clicked, a false bottom releasing with a soft groan of old wood. Underneath sat a ledger, thick and worn from handling, nothing like the polished books Gideon kept on display for anyone who came through his front office. Delaney opened it with hands that weren't quite steady, and Rowan held the lamp closer, and together they began reading by flickering light the true history of 15 years of Gideon Rusk's careful, calculated cruelty. It was worse than either of them had imagined. Page after page documented altered debts, manufactured shortfalls, terms changed after the fact and dated to look original. There was the Marsh place, exactly as Burl had said, and the Calloway place before it, and a dozen others Delaney had never heard mentioned, families who'd simply vanished from the valley over the years without anyone quite remembering to ask why. Their land absorbed quietly into holdings controlled, one way or another, by Gideon Rusk. And there, halfway through the book, in handwriting more agitated than the careful entries around it, was the section concerning Adeline Cross. Delaney's breath caught as she read it. It wasn't just confirmation of what Marta had told her. It was worse, and somehow also better. Worse, because it laid bare exactly how calculated Gideon's cruelty toward her mother had been, how deliberately he'd constructed the lie about hoarding supplies, specifically to discredit the woman whose efforts had cost him a fortune in land he'd hoped to seize during the famine winter. Better, because the entry, in Gideon's own hand, openly acknowledged the truth even while documenting the lie he intended to spread. A cross-organized valley relief effort cost approximately 40 properties I'd marked for acquisition. Countermeasure, hoarding allegation, sourced through Pratt and 2 others. Effective within 1 season. He wrote it down, Delaney said, her voice shaking, not from fear now, but from a fury that had been building for 12 years without ever having anywhere to land. He wrote down exactly what he did to her, like it was nothing more than a business transaction. Delaney. Rowan's hand came to rest on her shoulder, steadying. This is everything we need, more than we need. She kept reading, hands trembling now, and found the Ashcroft entry a few pages further on, dated barely 2 months earlier. Confirmation that the original note terms had indeed read through next spring, with a notation in Gideon's hand reading simply, "Accelerate. Distraction in kitchen makes this an opportune moment." The casual cruelty of that phrase, distraction in kitchen, hit Delaney harder than she expected. The reduction of everything she'd built at that ranch, every meal cooked, every garden row turned, every broken hen brought back to life, into nothing more than a convenient excuse for Gideon's own greed. "We need to copy what we can," Rowan said, already pulling paper and a stub of pencil from his coat. "Can't take the original. He'll notice it missing the moment he opens that drawer again. But if we copy enough, word for word, dates and figures matching." They worked fast and quiet, Delaney reading entries aloud while Rowan wrote, both of them glancing toward the front office every few minutes, hearts hammering at every creak of the old building settling in the cold. They'd been at it perhaps 20 minutes when Petrie's voice came through the wall, pitched higher than normal, carrying a warning neither of them could mistake. "Mr. Rusk, I wasn't expecting you back so soon, sir. I thought the Castleton business would keep you through tomorrow." Delaney's blood went cold. Rowan was already moving, sliding the ledger back into its hidden compartment, easing the drawer shut with hands that had gone fast and careful all at once. "Window," he whispered. "Now." They slipped out through the back room's single window into the alley behind the building, Delaney's heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The copied pages clutched tight against her chest as they pressed themselves into the shadows along the building's rear wall. Through the thin wall, they could hear Gideon's voice, cold and suspicious. "The back room. Why is the lamp burning?" "I was finishing some filing, sir. Didn't want to leave it for morning." "Filing." A pause, footsteps, the sound of a door opening. "At this hour?" "I know it's unusual, sir. Petrie." Gideon's voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. "What's been in this office tonight?" Delaney and Rowan exchanged a look in the darkness of the alley, both of them understanding exactly how much danger they'd just left Petrie standing in alone, and exactly how little time remained before they needed to be far from this building and far from town. They moved fast through the dark streets, untying their horses with hands that fumbled from cold and adrenaline both, and rode hard back toward the mountain road, not stopping, not speaking, until Red Hollow's lights had faded behind them and the only sound was hoofbeats and their own ragged breathing. "Petrie," Delaney said finally, when they'd slowed enough to talk. "What happens to him now?" "I don't know." Rowan's voice carried real worry. "But we can't go back for him tonight. Going back would just confirm whatever Rusk's already suspecting and put all three of us in worse danger than we're already in. We have to do something. He helped us. If Rusk hurts him because of it, we will. I promise you, we will." Rowan reached over in the darkness, found her hand, held it steady against his own. "But we need to think clear, not scared. We've got what we came for. Now we use it right, fast as we can, before Rusk has time to figure out exactly what's missing and cover his tracks." They reached the ranch well past midnight, exhausted and shaking with the aftermath of fear, and found Cyrus waiting up despite the hour, pacing the porch like a man who hadn't been able to sit still since they left. "Well," he said, the moment they swung down off their horses. "We got it," Delaney said. "Proof, real proof, in his own writing." She told them everything inside by lamplight, while Burl made coffee nobody really wanted, but everybody needed something to hold on to. And Wesley sat wide-eyed through the whole account, and Cyrus's jaw tightened tighter with every detail about Adeline Cross, about the marsh place, about Petrie's voice through that thin office wall. "We need this seen by more than just us," Rowan said, once Delaney had finished. "Copied evidence in our hands means nothing if it's just our words saying where it came from. We need witnesses. We need the Valley to see this together, all at once, before Rusk has any chance to spin a different story first." "The harvest gathering," Burl said suddenly. "Whole Valley turns out for that. Every rancher, every family, even folks from Castleton sometimes come through for it. 2 weeks off yet, but Rusk will already be moving against us by then," Cyrus said. "Man knows something's been taken. He'll have the 30 days called due faster than that, just out of spite, just to bury this before it gets the chance to spread." "Then we move the timeline up," Delaney said. "We don't wait for the gathering. We bring the proof to the Valley ourselves, however we can, before he has the chance to silence it." The room went quiet, all of them turning the problem over, looking for some way forward that didn't end with Petrie ruined, the ranch lost, and Gideon Rusk simply tightening his grip on a valley that had let him operate unchallenged for 15 years. It was Delaney, finally, who spoke the idea that had been building in her since that office, since reading her mother's true history in Gideon's own careless handwriting. "He humiliated my mother through food," she said slowly. "Used a famine to turn generosity into something shameful. What if we did the opposite? What if we gave this valley a reason to gather, to taste something good, to remember what it feels like to trust each other again? And then, once they're gathered, once they're listening, we show them the truth." "A feast," Rowan said, understanding dawning slow across his face. "A feast. Using everything this ranch has built since I came here, the garden, the hens nobody believed in, every broken, unwanted thing this valley decided wasn't worth the trouble." Delaney's voice had gone steady now, certain in a way that surprised even her. "Rusk built his whole power on convincing this valley that worth comes from what's useful, what's profitable, what looks good on a ledger. I want to prove him wrong in front of everybody who's ever doubted it." And once they're sitting at that table, full and grateful and finally paying attention, that's when we show them what he really is. Nobody spoke for a long moment, the weight and audacity of the plan settling over the kitchen. "That's either the smartest thing I've heard in 15 years, Cyrus said finally, or the most reckless. Maybe both." "Probably both," Delaney agreed, "but I don't see another way that gets us the whole valley listening at once before Rusk can stop us." Rowan looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his tired eyes. "Then we better start planning," he said. 2 weeks isn't much time to feed an entire valley and bring down an empire in the same afternoon." "No," Delaney agreed, feeling something settle into place inside her chest. Fear, still, but purpose riding right alongside it, steady and unwavering. "It isn't, so we'd best not waste a single day of it." Outside, the mountain wind picked up against the windows again, carrying the deepening cold of a winter closing in fast, and somewhere down in Red Hollow, Gideon Rusk sat awake in his office long past midnight, staring at a drawer that wouldn't quite close right anymore, already calculating how much damage had been done and exactly how viciously he intended to answer it. Word came up the mountain 2 days later that Petrie had vanished from Red Hollow entirely. Gideon had let him go that same night, no explanation given, and by morning the young clerk had packed what little he owned and left for parts unknown, rather than wait around to discover what else his former employer might decide he deserved. "That's on us," Delaney said, when Burl brought the news back from a supply run. "He helped us, and it cost him everything he had here." "It's on Rusk," Rowan said, "same as everything else that's happened to anybody unlucky enough to cross him." Petrie made his own choice that night. Doesn't mean the fault for what followed sits anywhere but on the man who forced it. Delaney wasn't fully convinced, the guilt of it sitting heavy in her chest alongside everything else she was carrying that week. But there wasn't time to dwell on guilt when there was a feast to build out of nothing and a valley's worth of buried truth to bring into the light before Gideon found some way to bury it deeper. The plan, once they'd talked it through fully, was simple in its bones and enormous in its execution. They would announce a gathering, not waiting for the harvest festival, but calling it sooner, framed as a celebration of the ranch's recovery. An invitation open to the whole valley, the kind of thing nobody in Red Hollow would think twice about attending, because free food and a reason to gossip was about the only entertainment that town reliably turned out for. "He'll know something's wrong with that timing," Cyrus warned. "Man's not a fool. Sudden feast right after his office gets broken into. He'll smell a trap." "Let him smell it," Delaney said. "Let him come expecting to make a fool of me in front of everybody, same as he tried at the auction all those months back. Men like that can't resist a chance to humiliate somebody publicly. It's how he's built his whole reputation. I'm counting on him not being able to stay away." She was right, as it turned out, though it would take the better part of 2 weeks of relentless, bone-tired work to find out just how right. The 2 weeks that followed blurred together into something Delaney would remember in fragments rather than whole memories. Pre-dawn mornings tending the coop, where Patch and Clover and the rest of the once-broken flock had multiplied into something close to 40 birds now, half of them rescued the same way the original 11 had been. Bought cheap and dismissed by ranchers across the valley, who'd started, almost without realizing it, bringing their own unwanted stock to the Ashcroft place rather than letting it go to slaughter for nothing. "Word travels," Burl said, the day a rancher from clear over by Castleton showed up with 3 half-blind ewes nobody else wanted, asking shy and hopeful whether Miss Cross might have use for them. "Folks have started hearing what you do with broken things up here. Some of them are starting to wonder if maybe broken ain't the same as worthless after all." It wasn't charity, not entirely. Delaney made sure every animal that came to the ranch earned its keep eventually, healed and put to use, the garden expanding right alongside the flock until the whole operation had grown into something neither she nor Rowan had quite planned for, but both of them found themselves grateful for anyway. The feast itself took every hour the ranch could spare. Delaney butchered birds she'd nursed back from the edge of uselessness, the same hens Gideon had once called fit only for stew, and turned them into something nobody in that valley would forget easily, roasted whole with herbs from the resurrected garden, stewed slow with root vegetables. Wesley and Cyrus hauled up from the cellar, the kind of cooking that came from a woman who'd spent her whole life learning how to make almost nothing taste like more than enough. Rowan handled the rest, sending word through the valley, arranging tables and benches borrowed from neighbors who'd grown curious enough about the Ashcroft Ranch's sudden revival to lend a hand without asking too many questions yet, smoothing over the practical details while Delaney poured every ounce of herself into the kitchen. They worked alongside each other in a way that had become so natural over the past months that neither of them commented on it anymore. The easy partnership of 2 people who'd started, somewhere in all that labor and worry, to lean on each other in ways that went beyond simple necessity. It was 3 nights before the gathering, both of them exhausted, sitting on the porch steps in the cold because neither wanted to go inside just yet, when Rowan finally said something neither of them had quite found the nerve to say outright before. "Whatever happens at this gathering," he said, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains rather than at her, "I want you to know this ranch is different because of you. Not just the garden, the kitchen, the flock. All of it matters. But it's not the whole of it." "What's the whole of it then?" Delaney asked, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. The house doesn't feel empty anymore. He turned to look at her then, and the lamplight from the kitchen window caught something raw and unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen from him before, not even in their easiest, most comfortable moments. I spent 3 years after Esther died just keeping this place standing because I didn't know how to do anything else with the grief. You walked in with broken chickens and stubbornness enough to shame a mule, and somehow you made it a home again. I don't know how to thank you for that properly. Delaney's throat went tight, the kind of tight that came before tears she wasn't sure she wanted to let fall in front of him. Not yet. Not with so much still uncertain hanging over both their heads. You don't have to thank me, she said. You're the only person who ever looked at me and saw something worth the trouble instead of something worth mocking. I think I've been trying to thank you for that every day since, the only way I know how. Through the kitchen, through the garden, through every broken thing I could find and fix. It's worked, Rowan said, something almost like a laugh in his voice, though his eyes stayed serious. More than worked. I just don't want you thinking the gratitude only runs one direction. He reached over, took her hand the way he had on the ride back from Rusk's office weeks before, except this time there was nothing practical or comforting about the gesture. Nothing born of fear or urgency. It was simply two people, tired and scared and hopeful all at once, choosing to hold on to something steady in the middle of everything uncertain still bearing down on them. Neither of them said anything else about it that night, but something had settled between them on that porch step, quiet and certain, the kind of understanding that didn't need declaring out loud to be real. The morning of the gathering dawned cold and clear, frost silvering the grass. And by midday the road up to the Ashcroft Ranch had filled with wagons and riders and walking families from every corner of the valley, drawn by curiosity and the smell of good cooking carrying further than anyone expected on the still mountain air. Gideon Rusk arrived mid-afternoon, exactly as Delaney had predicted he would, dressed sharp and confident, the easy smile already in place, the smile of a man who'd come expecting an opportunity rather than a reckoning. Quite the turnout, he said to Rowan, his eyes scanning the gathered crowd, the long tables laden with food, the children already running between adults' legs, chasing each other with the particular wild joy of kids who sensed something festive in the air, even if they didn't understand why. Didn't realize the ranch had recovered quite this thoroughly. Funny, given the state of your accounts, last I checked. Accounts are being settled, Rowan said evenly. We'll discuss it properly once the day's business is finished. I look forward to it. Gideon's gaze slid toward Delaney, who stood near the food tables directing the last of the serving, and his smile sharpened into something crueler. Miss Cross, I see you've kept yourself busy playing at hospitality. Suits you better than the auction yard did, I'll grant that much. Funny, Delaney said, not missing a beat. I was about to say the same about you and honest bookkeeping. A few people standing close enough to overhear went still, glancing between the two of them with the particular alertness of folks who sensed something more than pleasantries passing underneath the words. Gideon's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened. You should be careful with accusations you can't substantiate, Miss Cross, he said, low enough that only those nearby caught it. Your mother learned that lesson the hard way. Be ashamed to see her daughter repeat the mistake. I don't intend to repeat anything, Delaney said. I intend to correct it. She didn't give him time to respond to that, turning instead to address the gathered crowd, her voice raised loud enough to carry over the general noise of the afternoon. Friends, she called out, and the crowd's attention drifted toward her gradually, conversation quieting in ripples outward from where she stood. Thank you all for coming today. I know plenty of you remember me from less generous circumstances. I bought a crate of broken chickens at auction some months back, and most of this valley had a good laugh over it. Scattered, uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd, people glancing at each other, unsure whether this was meant to be funny or something else entirely. Everybody in this valley decided those birds were worthless, Delaney continued. Same way plenty of you decided I was worthless growing up here. Too big, too poor, too strange for anybody's liking. Her voice stayed steady despite the old hurt sitting underneath every word. But I want you to taste something today before you decide anything else about what's worth your time and what isn't. She gestured toward the long tables, toward the roasted birds and the stews and the bread, baked from grain the garden had finally yielded in abundance. Every bit of this came from creatures and crops this valley gave up on. The chickens nobody wanted. A garden everybody said was dead. I'm asking you to eat and decide for yourselves whether broken really means finished or whether it just means somebody hadn't found the patience yet to fix it. For a long, uncertain moment, nobody moved. Then a child, barefoot, thin, clearly from one of the valley's poorer families, broke from his mother's side and approached the table, looking up at Delaney with open, hungry curiosity rather than any of the careful suspicion the adults were still working through. "Can I try some?" he asked. "Help yourself," Delaney said, kneeling to fill a plate for him herself. The boy ate, and his face lit up with the particular delighted surprise of a child discovering something genuinely good, and he turned back toward the crowd and announced, loud and entirely without guile, "This is the best chicken I ever had." It broke something open in the gathered crowd, the particular spell of collective hesitation that kept a group of people locked in old judgments even when curiosity was pulling at every one of them individually. Another family stepped forward, then another. Within minutes, the tables were surrounded, plates filling, the valley's careful suspicion dissolving into the simple, undeniable pleasure of a genuinely good meal shared in good company. Delaney watched it happen with something tight and hopeful in her chest, watched Burl and Wesley and Cyrus moving through the crowd, refilling plates, watched Rowan standing near the edge of it all with an expression of quiet, fierce pride that he didn't bother hiding. And she watched Gideon Rusk standing slightly apart from the celebration, his easy smile gone rigid, calculating, as he realized exactly how badly his planned humiliation had failed to land. It was Miriam Holloway, the valley's oldest living resident, a woman in her 70s who'd outlived 2 husbands and most of her contemporaries and had earned, through sheer longevity and sharp memory, the kind of respect nobody in Red Hollow dared question, who finally said what needed saying. She'd been sitting near the edge of the gathering, watching the feast with quiet attention, and when she finally rose to her feet, leaning heavy on her cane, the crowd's chatter gradually died down out of simple deference to her age and standing. "I remember another famine," Miriam said, her voice carrying further than her frail frame suggested it should. "Back when most of you weren't but children, or not born at all yet. Hardest winter this valley ever saw. Half of you would have starved that season, if not for one woman who organized the whole valley into sharing what little anybody had." A murmur moved through the crowd, confusion and curiosity mixing together. "That woman's name was Adeline Cross," Miriam continued, and Delaney felt her whole body go still, felt Rowan's hand find hers without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other. "Some of you might recall a different story about her, a story about hoarding, about favoring some families over others while the rest of us suffered. I want every soul standing here today to know that story was a lie, manufactured and spread for reasons that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with greed." "That's a serious accusation, Miriam," Gideon called out, his voice carrying an edge of warning now, the careful pleasantness from earlier entirely gone. "Memory plays tricks on the old. I'd be careful repeating gossip you can't prove." "I don't need to prove what I lived through myself," Miriam shot back, sharper than her age suggested she could manage. "I was there. I watched Adeline Cross go without sleep for a week straight, organizing relief for families who wouldn't even speak her name kindly afterward. I've carried the shame of staying quiet about it for 12 years, same as plenty of others in this valley. I won't carry it any longer." The crowd's attention had shifted entirely now, the easy festival atmosphere replaced by something tighter, more charged, every eye moving between Miriam, Gideon, and Delaney in turn. This was the moment. Delaney felt it arrive like a held breath finally released, and she stepped forward, the copied pages from Gideon's hidden ledger held tight in her hand. "Miriam's telling this truth," she said, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "And I have proof of it, in Mr. Rusk's own handwriting." Gideon's composure cracked fully then, his face going hard and dangerous in a way the easy smile had never let show before. "Whatever forged nonsense you're waving around, Miss Cross, I'd think carefully before making accusations you'll regret. It's not forged. It's copied directly from a ledger kept hidden in your own office, the one with different numbers than the books you show honest folks." Delaney unfolded the pages, her hand steady now despite everything riding on this moment. "It documents exactly what you did to my mother's reputation, written in your own words. It documents the same thing you tried to do to Rowan Ashcroft's ranch just this month. And it documents 15 years of altered debts and manufactured shortfalls, that cost families across this entire valley their homes, their land, their futures. Lies, Gideon said. But something in his voice had lost its certainty, his eyes flicking toward the crowd, now watching him with an attention that had shifted, gradually but unmistakably, from curiosity into something colder. The Marsh Place, Delaney read aloud, her voice ringing clear. The Calloway Place. 40 properties marked for acquisition during the famine winter, countermeasure noted as hoarding allegation, sourced through Pratt, and 2 others. Effective within 1 season. She looked up, met Gideon's eyes directly. That's your handwriting, Mr. Rusk. Your own words, documenting your own deliberate cruelty. A man near the front of the crowd, heavy-set, weathered, someone Delaney didn't recognize, pushed forward suddenly, his face flushed with old, long-buried anger. That's my family's land you're talking about. The Marsh Place. My grandfather lost everything that winter, and you're telling me it was never an honest debt at all. It was never honest, Delaney said. None of it ever was. The crowd's mood had turned entirely now, the festival warmth replaced by something sharper, angrier, a valley's worth of quiet resentments and unexplained losses suddenly finding a single source to focus on after years of having nowhere to direct the grief. This is preposterous, Gideon said, but he was backing away now, the crowd's attention closing in around him like water finding its level. I won't stand here and be slandered by a desperate woman and a senile old— Watch your tongue, Rowan said, stepping forward, his voice low and dangerous in a way Delaney had never heard from him before. You've done enough damage in this valley without adding insult to people who've already lost plenty because of you. The magistrate, an older man Delaney recognized from town, pushed through the crowd looking deeply uncomfortable but unable to ignore what was happening in front of an audience this large. Mr. Rusk, he said, given the seriousness of what's being alleged here, and given that there appear to be multiple witnesses and documentation, I'm afraid I have no choice but to call for a formal hearing into these claims. The sooner, the better, given the circulation this has already received today. You can't possibly take seriously. I can, and I will, the magistrate said, his discomfort hardening into something more resolved as more people in the crowd began speaking up, sharing their own stories now, the dam finally breaking on years of quiet suspicion that had never found enough collective courage to surface until this exact moment. Tomorrow, my office. Bring whatever defense you intend to offer, Mr. Rusk, because from where I'm standing, you're going to need it. The hearing, when it came, lasted the better part of 2 days. The magistrate's office packed tight with ranchers and families from across the valley, all of them eager to see whether justice might finally arrive for grievances most had given up hoping would ever be addressed. Gideon fought it, of course, hired what legal counsel he could from Castleton, tried every argument available to discredit the copied ledger pages, claimed forgery, claimed conspiracy, claimed Delaney and Rowan had fabricated the entire affair out of spite over a legitimate business debt. But the evidence held. Marta testified to what she remembered of the famine winter. Miriam testified with the sharp, unshakable clarity of a woman who'd carried her guilt long enough to be done flinching from the truth. The Marsh family's surviving relative testified about land lost under circumstances that, examined now in proper light, looked nothing like the honest transaction Gideon had always claimed. And when the magistrate's own investigators finally gained access to Gideon's actual office, armed with a warrant that wouldn't have existed without the public spectacle of that gathering forcing the issue into the open, they found the real ledger exactly where Petrie had described it, every detail matching the copied pages precisely. The fraud was extensive enough that it took weeks to fully untangle, but the initial ruling came fast enough to matter. The Ashcroft note was voided entirely, the original terms reinstated, and Gideon Rusk's broader pattern of manufactured debts referred for a full criminal accounting that would, in the months that followed, see him stripped of his business, his landholding seized to repay the families he'd defrauded, and his name turned into exactly the kind of cautionary tale he'd spent 15 years making sure other people's names became instead. He left the valley before the worst of it caught up to him fully, slipping away one night much the way Petrie had, except nobody offered him any sympathy on his way out the door. Petrie, as it turned out, hadn't gone far. Rowan tracked him down in Castleton within a month, offered him steady work at the ranch as a bookkeeper, the kind of honest position the young man had never quite believed he'd find after everything that happened. He took it gratefully, and within the year had become as much a fixture of the Ashcroft operation as Burl or Cyrus or Wesley, a quiet reminder of the courage it had taken him to risk everything for people who, at the time, had been near strangers to him. The ranch in the months that followed became something neither Delaney nor Rowan had quite imagined when this whole strange chapter started with a crate of broken hens at auction. Other families, hearing what had happened, started bringing their unwanted stock by, not out of pity, but out of genuine curiosity about whether the Ashcroft touch could work the same magic for them. Delaney never turned anyone away, never charged more than seemed fair, and slowly, steadily, the ranch grew into something the whole valley had a hand in rebuilding, even if Delaney's hands had done most of the actual labor. It was Rowan's idea, eventually, to put a name to what they'd built. Not just a ranch anymore, but something closer to a gathering place, a roadside table where anyone passing through, rancher or miner or traveling family, could find a hot meal regardless of what they could afford to pay for it. "Cross an Ashcroft," he said, the evening he proposed it, sitting across the kitchen table from her the way they had so many evenings since that first stew nearly a year before. "Summer table, what do you think?" "I think you're putting my name first," Delaney said, which feels backward, given whose ranch this technically still is. "It's not backward. It's accurate." Rowan reached across the table, took her hand the way he'd taken to doing whenever the words underneath his meaning ran deeper than the surface conversation. "This place was dying before you walked into it with a crate of chickens nobody wanted. Everything good that's grown here since has your name on it, whether the deed says so or not." "Maybe it's time the deed caught up to the truth then," Delaney said, and watched something soften and brighten in his face all at once. He asked her properly, a week later, not with any grand gesture, just the two of them in the garden at dusk, surrounded by rows of vegetables that had grown thick and healthy out of soil everyone once swore was dead beyond saving. "I'm not asking because you saved this ranch," he said, kneeling there in the dirt with the same plain, unhurried honesty he'd shown her that first day at the auction yard. "I'm asking because somewhere in all of that saving, you taught me how to be alive again, and I don't want to spend whatever years I've got left figuring that out without you standing right next to me while I do it." She said yes before he'd even finished the sentence properly, and neither one of them minded the dirt on their knees when he pulled her down into an embrace that felt, finally, like coming home to something that had been waiting for her all along. Years later, when travelers passing through the valley asked about the roadside table where the food was good and nobody ever got turned away hungry, regardless of what was in their pocket, the locals would tell them about Delaney Cross, the woman everyone once mocked for buying broken chickens, who'd ended up teaching an entire valley what it meant to look at something the world had given up on and see possibility instead of waste. They'd tell it differently depending on who was talking. Some emphasized the scandal the corrupt broker brought low, the satisfying justice of watching a cruel man lose everything he'd built on other people's suffering. Others focused on the romance, the quiet rancher, and the woman who'd brought his grieving house back to life. But the story Delaney herself told, on the rare occasion someone asked her directly, was simpler than either version and truer than both. She'd tell them that the world has a habit of deciding what's worth saving before it ever bothers asking the thing itself. That broken and worthless aren't the same word, no matter how often people use them interchangeably. That sometimes the people everyone else gives up on are exactly the ones who end up teaching the rest of the world how healing actually works, because they've had more practice at it than anybody who never needed saving in the first place. She never forgot what it felt like to stand at that auction yard with $2 and a crate of birds nobody wanted, the whole town laughing at her expense. But she'd learned eventually that the laughter said more about the people doing it than it ever said about her, and that the truest answer to cruelty wasn't bitterness or revenge. It was simply choosing every single day after to keep believing in broken things anyway, until the broken things proved everybody wrong,